in the interest of time, I think we'll get started here today. So thank you for everybody for being here today. We're really excited about this week's session and everything that we're talking about today. And so today we're focusing on the advisory committee itself and a look inside the process. And so we have two great panels planned for you today, which we're very excited about. And I just want to discuss some logistics for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box. That's the best way for our moderator and our panelists to see your questions and to be able to answer them. If you want to discuss anything else among the attendees or about your input, please feel free to use the chat box to really kind of use both and really to improve the conversation between attendees amongst themselves. And so before we get started, I just want to give a quick thank you to our sponsors who are making all of this possible. And then we're going to get right into it. So I want to thank our panel that is going to be with us today. And I'm going to pass over to Natasha Bonhomme for Genetic Alliance, who will be moderating today's panel. So I stop sharing my screen. And Natasha, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. And welcome everyone to this third day of our newborn screening boot camp. We've covered a lot in the first 2 days, and I know today will be exactly the same in terms of a wealth of information. So as Dylan said, please, we really encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A section of the Zoom interface and to have discussions with each other through the chat. We have a great group of people for this first session that we're doing today. So I will ask everyone who's on here to give an introduction to themselves. So many have been with us already during this boot camp. But if everyone could say your name, your organization, or your affiliation, and just 2 or 3 minutes on kind of the work that you've done with the advisory committee, either currently or in the past. And so with that, we will start with Dr. Cynthia Powell.
Thank you, Natasha. Yes, I'm Cindy Powell. I'm a medical geneticist and professor at the North Carolina School of Medicine in Chapel Hill, and I'm currently the chair of the advisory committee.
Great, thank you. Next, we will go to Dr. Alex Kemper.
Hi, thank you very much, Natasha, and let me say how delighted I am to be here, and Dylan and the other organizers, thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm a general pediatrician, and I oversee the Division of Primary Care Pediatrics at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And I chair the evidence review work group for the advisory committee. So just to be clear, I'm not a member of the advisory committee, but we do work on behalf of the advisory committee to synthesize evidence and that sort of thing to inform decisions.
Great, thank you, Alex. And next, Dr. KK Lamb.
Hi, thanks, Natasha. Hi, I'm KK Lamb. I am a school and pediatric psychologist by training, but I've been working with Alex. I've had the pleasure of working with him for just shy of 10 years. And serve as the project director for the external evidence review group. So similar to Alex, I'm not a part of the advisory committee. We are considered external to them, but we work with them and with HRSA officials and to support the work and provide the evidence reviews and synthesize evidence and the methods.
Great, thank you so much, KK. And Terry Klein.
Hi, everyone. And again, thank you, Every Life Foundation, for asking us to represent the patient advocacy group in this panel. It really is a delight. It's been so informative. I'm the president and CEO of the National MPS Society. I've been with the organization as a member for a little over 20 years now. I do have a daughter that's affected by the mucolipidosis, and so they've been our support group for many years. We support 11 diseases at the National MPS Society, the mucopolysaccharidosis and the mucolipidosis. And I've been employed by the organization for 12 years now.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for those introductions. So we will follow a format where I will ask each of you individually certain questions, and then that'll probably take the first 20 to 30 minutes of this panel, and then we will go into kind of broader questions for all of you. And to our participants during that time, please submit your questions, and we will get to them as we go along. But my first question is to KK. If you could speak a little bit about what is taken into consideration by the committee before a package is referred to the evidence review. So even before it gets to you all, what do you know is already done and reflected upon? And I will say, don't worry, I won't be super strict. If someone else wants to chime in on the question, they can. But just kind of want to get your perspective on that, KK.
Yeah, sure. So before a condition is requested for a full evidence review, of course, it is probably most know now, there's a nomination package that's put together. And so there now are pretty established questions that are considered by the committee, and in particular by the nomination and prioritization work group, which is a subgroup of the committee. And those main questions are looking at whether is the nominated condition medically serious? And then what do we know about the condition? And in particular, the case definition, especially now the conditions that seem to be coming forward are often complex. And so, for instance, both early onset phenotypes and later onset, and at the point of newborn screening, what can we learn about, or what are we able to predict about the severity? So those pieces really honing in on that case definition of what's being screened and nominated for treatment. Then also with screening is how accurate is the screening method that we have available now at finding newborns with the condition. We look scientifically at the analytic validity. In the lab, is the screening process sensitive and specific enough to find babies with the condition, and also to not find babies with the condition, and not identify babies as positive who do not have the condition, that is false positives. And that's probably a big one in particular in the public health labs, right? To try and keep the number of false positives that come up through the system at a minimum. So besides the analytic validity in the lab, the clinical utility that comes up, in particular, can the screening process identify, does it identify newborns with positive screens where there's some clinical usefulness? The medical providers want to be able to do something for those babies, even if it's watchful monitoring. Then, are there treatments available for the condition? And that is a big one. They need to be standard of care, not necessarily through the FDA. It depends on what the treatments are, but something that's standard of care and more than just supportive care. And they need to be pretty well defined, certainly for the more immediate ones. And the relatively newer piece that has come aboard on what the committee is looking at for nomination is the prospective pilot data. Looking at, are there data to understand how well the overall screening process works, particularly in a high throughput situation, right, to do population-based screening, to be able to go from the beginning to identify prospectively to screen, check out the screening algorithm, and then be able to identify which newborns are positive and will require a referral. And then that there's even at least links to providers who can then care for these newborns. So those are the key things. The committee, the nomination and prioritization work group presents all that information to the committee, and they do follow those key questions pretty closely as they go through. The other key thing about the Prospective pilot I will add is, you know, with being able to demonstrate that that the screening process works, they do look for seeing an actual true positive case coming through, so they can see the full process and to make sure it truly is working.
Great, thank you for that. I know oftentimes we focus on the screen and, you know, those components of it, but it really shows that from the beginning, the committee is looking for the entire system from beginning to end in terms of not just detecting or identifying a child with a condition, but really getting them into care, that the care is available, and what that entire experience would look like and what the opportunities are there for. So thank you for laying that out. My next question is for Alex. In your time in working with the evidence review process, can you speak a bit about how it has evolved to where it is today? Any changes that have happened, or even in just how the information is collected or presented, just how that has built upon itself over the number of years that you've been involved in it?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk about it. And I have to say that when KK mentioned that we've been working on this together for 10 years, it was kind of jarring to me at first, but it's true that we've been working on this for a long time. And there have been a number of additions and changes to the evidence review process. But the key things to focus on is that when we do these evidence reviews, we are trying to be comprehensive about the whole system, as you just described it. And we're also going to be transparent about where the evidence is and where there are evidence gaps. Just because there's an evidence gap doesn't mean that screening might not be a good thing, but it's important to understand what we know and what we don't know, so that regardless of what the advisory committee recommends, that we can continue to do those things to both help children and their families, and also to help resolve wherever there are important scientific gaps that could further help families and individuals take care of themselves. So back in the beginning, we really focused on looking at the studies that were out there related to screening and treatment, and that's still a core component. Over time, though, we've expanded in certain areas. So we look at all the evidence that's out there related to screening and the benefits of early detection, and what happens long-term for individuals who are treated versus treated through newborn screening versus those who might come to clinical diagnosis some other way. When we do that component to the evidence review, we've expanded things to look at important components of the evidence that might not otherwise come through a literature search. We really have a better way of looking at what's referred to as the gray literature. Those are unpublished studies. And as we increasingly look at conditions for which the science is evolving quickly, understanding that gray literature is really important. So that's one component. The second component that's tightly tied to the evidence review is what we refer to as modeling. So after we do the evidence review, we get a sense of how good the screening tests are at identifying newborns with a condition. We have a good sense of what the epidemiology is, how many babies are born each year with the condition, and we know something about treatment. So what we do is, working with Dr. Lisa Prosser, who's at the University of Michigan, is we build a model that compares what would happen if you were to screen all 4 million babies born in the country for the condition, compared to what would happen if you didn't screen. So we can talk about the number of cases that would be detected, certainly number of false positives, and what the benefit of early detection might be compared to detection when children might come to attention some other way. That's a way of synthesizing and presenting information from the evidence review that can sometimes make the issues more clear, and that's how we do that. The other component to the evidence review that's really wasn't there in the beginning and has really expanded is our work with the newborn screening programs to better understand, are they able to screen for the condition, or if they're currently not able to screen for the condition, what would it take for them to get to that point? As part of the requirements for the work that we do, we also look at the cost of the screening. So we don't look at all the costs related to the whole system as you described it, but we try to estimate what the cost is within the newborn screening program to screen for that new condition. Again, decisions are not based on that cost directly, but it's one more data element to help the advisory committee when they make recommendations to understand what kind of resources are needed if it turns out that screening for the condition is recommended. So those are really the key elements that we now put together. Another big change is that the evidence review process, once a nomination has been handed to us, the timeline that we have to complete things is 9 months. So it's 9 months from the time that we get the condition to the time that we present the report to the advisory committee for them to proceed as the advisory committee decides to. So it really compresses a complicated timeline into a short period of time. And that's why the nomination process is so important, because that's what launches us. And so if you look at the components that KK just talked about, what goes into the nomination process and what things we look in the evidence review are really hand in glove.
Great, thank you for that. And I appreciate you bringing up the 9 months, because as you mentioned, this is not your full-time job. This is something that you all are doing in addition to your full-time work. So having that information as early as possible is really key.
Yeah, and let me, can I just tag on one thing?
Absolutely.
That's right. So, you're correct that it's not my full-time job, that I have other activities, but, HRSA funds this work. And so the fact that I have, other activities and that kind of stuff doesn't mean that the process, doesn't move forward and the things aren't done in 9 months. What I would say though, is that it's really important to have the nomination process in good shape, only because we have this 9-month period. And if we're not clear, for example, about what it is exactly we're screening for, what's the case definition, what's the ultimate goal of the screening, then we might spend a lot of time working on it and then find out that the nominators may have been thinking about it one way and that the advisory committee was thinking about it another way. And you lose that time. And so really being clear about what the goal of screening is just so fundamental. And I didn't talk about this before, but as soon as we get a nomination, we actually have meetings with the nominators, and we form this thing called a technical expert panel that all just make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. And related to this 9-month issue, a question that's come up to me in our process is, why only do one condition at a time? Can't we think about multiple conditions and those kinds of things? Actually, in between meetings, I got asked that a number of times. In our role as the evidence review work group, we're happy to do whatever. If we get a bunch of conditions, handed to us, then, it's our job to make sure that we, appropriately allocate who's working on what so that things can get done. So that 9-month is constrains us in terms of how long we get it done, but working with HRSA, who funds our work, and with the advisory committee, who we put work for, it's just really having clarity around what would most help with the ultimate decision. But the fact that I have a different job, or the fact that we've only been getting like one condition at a time, doesn't minimize our commitment to the process. And if we had like multiple things, then we would, get other people engaged as necessary.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. Next question is for Cindy. So following this work that both Alex and KK were just talking about in terms of the evidence review, what does the full advisory committee consider when discussing adding a condition? Are there certain themes that seem to come up time and again when thinking about the past few conditions that have come back to the full committee for discussion? Or are there certain topics that have come up, that are maybe one-off or outliers, but really provoked a lot of discussion with committee members?
Well, I think that, we try to focus on that part of the decision matrix that is there definite or is it likely that there will be net benefit for patients, through this screening. And of course, it's a complex thing to think about. It's not only the treatment, but it's also the impact on the public health system, and as well as the number of false positive screens. So I think there's often a lot of concern about imagining this being put into effect in a state newborn screening program, and what types of effects will there be? How many infants will be identified? How many will have false positive screens? I know that's often something that comes up quite often, is putting families through the process of getting that call and going through confirmatory testing and having it be negative. And what percentage of infants screened will fall into that category. The committee takes very seriously that although putting a condition onto the RUSP, it's up to each state whether or not they will put that into their screening panel. Although a number of states now have it, is legislation that they have to add a condition that's on the RUSP within a certain period of time. So, we have to be so careful about not wanting to jeopardize the whole system, through a new condition that might create great difficulty for, the newborn screening system, for families, patients. And I think, we talk a lot about that possibility. So the more data that we have, the easier it is to make decisions about things like that. I think that, and one thing I wanted to emphasize, in addition to all the information that KK and Alex are able to find, the surveys that the Association of Public Health Laboratories, or APHL, does, surveying the state newborn screening lab personnel, is very important. And that's recently been expanded, the information that they're trying to gather as part of the evidence gathering for this. So I don't think the latest iteration of that has actually been utilized yet. So the plan is that they'll be able to gather hopefully some additional information in surveying a number of states, just to get as much feedback as possible. Not just, are you ready to start doing this immediately, but how long would it take? How difficult would it be? I think one thing that has been very challenging to get is, what is the impact on the follow-up part of the newborn screening system? We're not only recommending a condition that might be screened for in New York State or California or Massachusetts, but in states like Mississippi, where they may only have one medical geneticist and very few, if any, specialists who may be able to follow these babies. And, for some of the newer conditions, where will they go for, intrathecal therapy, placing the treatment into the spinal canal, that's certainly not something that a general pediatrician can do. So a baby's going to need to see a specialist. And also, you know, for, let's say, a bone marrow transplant, you know, where will they go for that? And I think that that's something that would be helpful for organizations who are, you know, submitting a package to think about, you know, what's the follow-up going to look like? And it's, you know, yes, we definitely want a accurate screening test that, you know, is highly sensitive and as specific as possible. But also, you know, what's the follow-up going to be like? And, you know, and that's something that is hard because for some conditions for which, you know, there's very promising treatments, maybe, you know, a treatment that's been approved already by the FDA, but there's often not a lot of data on what, you know, treatment of those babies, you know, prior to symptom onset really, you know, is going to impact what that's going to be like. And I think, you know, in that 9-month time frame that Dr. Kemper was talking about, you know, it's really tough to be able to gather all that information, but yet there's the need to, you know, do things as quickly as possible. So I think that, you know, as much information as groups can submit, and also, you know, once a nomination package is submitted to HRSA, HRSA does a review. And so they'll often, you know, provide feedback to those who have submitted if there's certain things that are lacking. So, you know, that can be very helpful before the committee even has a chance to see anything. They can get feedback from HRSA about that. So I urge groups, even before they submit, you know, to contact the folks at HRSA and get additional information. And then, as KK was saying, you know, we hope to, you know, kind of improve the guidelines for that submission.
Great, thank you for that. And that is a perfect segue into the question I have for Terry, which, you know, could you speak a bit about the lessons that you learned from your role in putting together a package for MPS 1, and then kind of what you learned in that process and what you carried forward when you were working on the most recent package that you worked on, which I believe was for MPS 2, and just kind of the lessons learned around that and what made the first go around different from the second go around?
Thanks, Natasha, for the question. I think it's really important to probably note that, you know, lessons learned aren't always about what you might have gotten wrong, but also recognizing what you might have gotten right. And you're reconfirming the process that you've gone through possibly, which for us was in 2012 to today, when we have recently submitted for the MPS 2 RUS nomination. And I just wanted to share that, you know, in this process, we recognize that we're still in this phase of working with states and legislation to be able to begin screening for MPS 1. And so though we've gotten that approval in 2016, we're still in that state-by-state process. And that is a learning process, right? But while we're doing this, the question becomes, do we have another disease that's ready for nomination? And do we have the key components that's necessary for us to put forth evidence to say, we do have a disease that's life-threatening and is terminal, but we also have the ability to save this child's life through newborn screening because we do have life-saving therapies. And so it's kind of a twofold. And I wanted to present it that way because I don't know that we've got a lot of things wrong in 12, but lessons also are about reconfirming. So you're like, all right, we've got this right, but we might have to change the timeline that's around this and what it looks like. And so I think it's important to know that. But before I go into some bullet point items that I had kind of written down, I wanted to share one real key program change that the National MPS Society made because of newborn screening. And so it had always been a goal of our organization to move into providing direct social service support to our families. And we've talked about it for years, and we knew that we were working in this newborn screening space. And what would that mean for families at the time of diagnosis when they got a contact from the health department that indeed they have a positive screening, or from their primary care physician, and where do they go, and what does that look like? And what would it be if we could bring social workers on staff to work with us full time to meet with families at the time of diagnosis? And so we implemented that program after the MPS 1 newborn screening went into effect. And in May of 2017, the program began. And since that point, we have seen exponentially amount of families that have screened with their children for MPS 1. And the level of education support that they can get from our social workers to be able to quickly make decisions about the care for their child and the decisions that they need to make has been more than we could have ever expected. More than we could have ever expected. We are seeing all of the diseases. So any child that's diagnosed with any of the 11 diseases, our Pathways program is involved in. But let me provide you with a couple of numbers. We have 2 social workers that work full-time in this space. And since the program was implemented, we've seen over 200 families, not just in a teleconference like we are now because of the COVID-19, but face-to-face meetings. They have flown across the entire country, meeting with patients, and the number of families that we're seeing because of the MPS 1 newborn screening that's available to them has completely changed the bell curve of what we're doing. And so we know that we needed to provide resources. We knew that we needed to take on that role as well, because the goal is if we find a child that unfortunately is diagnosed with this disease, we needed to bring them something more. We had no model to work off of. We reached out to different programs. We didn't have people in our space that had built such a program that looked like this. But we believed in it, and we knew that it was essential for the newborn screening process, and we wanted to be there for the families during that time. So I wanted to share that. And then let me share a couple of things that we also learned along the way. And some of them are going to seem basic, but it's these basic tools that are so relevant and so important so that you can have success in the nomination process. And when I say success in the nomination, I'm not saying the approval, because that becomes out of my hands. What I mean is the success process of bringing your expert team together so that each of you understands your roles in this large project of a nomination, so that you can deliver what is essential for evidence-based review, and you have the supporting documentation to say that newborn screening can work. And so some of those areas include knowing really what this nomination is. You have to understand the entire form, and you have to understand what is requested by HRSA and the ACHDNC committee, and you need to know it intimately. And it is the responsibility of the patient advocacy group to understand the terms and to know this. You don't need to know the science, but you need to know what these terms mean. Your role is to be able to bring the experts to the table with you, to work with you through the newborn screening process. So you can't negate the fact that this is a responsibility that you have to hold as a patient advocacy leader. You have to do your due diligence. So I can't say that enough. I'm all about the knowledge and the learning. The second area is you really need to know who your key stakeholders are. And I had talked about this in a previous presentation, but leaving out a key stakeholder could cost time. A lot of time if you don't have the right people sitting down with you on your expert team so that you can build out all of the different portions of the nomination form. You also need to realize from a patient advocacy standpoint, when you're putting a nomination together, ensuring that your board of directors and ensuring that your internal team truly understands the amount of resources it's going to require of your time, and what does that look like for the overall projection of the rest of the mission that you're serving? Because this is something that takes time. And I've said it before, but whatever timeline you think it might be, you might as well just throw that away and double it. And it's okay, because you want to be able to create the time to sink deep within any question that the committee is going to come back to you with in terms of the review process. You want to be able to have the ability to bring your key expert team back together on these important meetings. While we've gone through the processes, I really needed to identify at the very beginning of my expert team, bringing it together, that we needed to know they were accessible to us, that there was levels of accountability, because we needed to know who we could bring to the table quickly to help answer questions, because there were questions or there might have been gaps in information. And so I've learned very quickly that you need to know those people up front so you can do that. Another lesson that we learned in this space is that there's different ways to be able to construct the RUSP nomination. I have been so thankful for the key stakeholders in the group that we had for the MPS 2 RUSP nomination, because we absolutely included some of our industry experts who helped us understand that we could have the confidence to do this because of the resource of time. We are not the organization we were in 2012. We have grown exponentially because our membership has increased over 310% in the last 3 years. We're no longer in 750 households. We're in over 2,000 households across the country. And so there are other critical missions that are taking place, and it's okay to say, how can my key expert team include stakeholders that may look different than what we had in 2012, and who can contribute to this process? And so understanding that was vital, and also having that board understand the amount of time that's going to be involved from your position to bring this forward. And then also, and it was already touched on by both Dr. Kemper and Dr. Lamb, was that we have to remember our goal is to be as transparent as possible. And though we may not have had some transparency because we didn't hit where we needed to at first with the MPS 1 nomination and we needed to go through the review processes, we're in that same process now. And although we might think we have transparency in everything we're doing, we have to look at it from somebody that's seen it with a fresh perspective. Have we really proven our case? And have we truly given everything? And when I didn't recognize that, for instance, unpublished information would be critical in a nomination process, it is okay. They want to see this type of information too. So though I may have 35 or 50 resources, if there is a piece that's going to help with transparency, that's unpublished data, it is okay to provide that. And that's not something I necessarily know that we did with the MPS 1 nomination. In the end, it's really all about communication. It's about communication, and that seems like one of those basics. But communication is key because a lot of times you're in this electronic mode of communicating, and you may not be able to convey the message that you need to convey. You can have all of your writing together. You can have your nomination in a nice package with a cover letter. In the end, those initial communication pieces are happening via email. So really understand what email communication is. Brush up on your skills. I don't mean to say that to be silly. I'm really serious. Brush up on your skills and think about the context of the sentences that you're writing and how you're putting that together, because people will interpret things differently. And you want to make sure that you're staying positive in this long project, because it's a long project and you want to keep your expert team motivated. And I think those are some of the really important lessons we've learned in terms of at least the construction phase of the nomination.
Can I add something onto that? What you said about communication is just so critical. And I appreciate that us on the evidence review side of things, we tend to use words in a very particular way that doesn't necessarily, you know, even line up with like the lay use of a word, you know what I mean? But I think it's important to remember, like, our process in the evidence review and your process in the nomination process is not antagonistic. Like, it's our job to be able to understand what you're trying to teach us, because you really do teach us through the nomination package. And we want to be able to present that to the advisory committee so that everybody understands what we know and what we don't know and where the opportunities are to improve things. But I shudder sometimes because people think that, like, you know, that like our job is to slow things down or stop things or whatever. But really, we want to work with the people that are putting together packages for nomination so that a really informed decision can be made. And even if something doesn't get added to the rest, it's usually because, like, well, we don't know the best way to do X. You know what I mean? And if we don't know the best way to do something, then that's something that either industry or a federal funding agency or someone should jump in to help resolve. But you know, I've learned so much from the people that put together nomination packages, and it's so much work on your end. And we really, really, really want to be able to just take what you hand us and be able to put it in this more scientific package for the advisory committee. But it's not meant to be antagonistic, although I'm sure that people feel that way as we ask questions and try to learn.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Dr. Kemper, because I've kind of embraced it that way. And I wasn't the front seat person for the 2012 nomination for MPS 1, but I was right there as a support staff person. But I've always, these are lessons learned. We're all working towards this goal. And the question is can we prove that the newborn screening process will work for MPS 2? Have we given you enough information to say the pilot study is showing the accuracy? We have the ability to reach to the patients at the time of diagnosis. These are the systems that are built, and you're helping us to understand if we've got a gap. And it's all about us can we respond to those gaps? Because we have to have the evidence. And so I appreciate it. It's a partnership.
Great, thank you for that. And both of you actually were steering into my next question, which really is just open to everyone to discuss, is, have there been examples or experiences of a condition being nominated and not going through the entire process in the first shot, and what that looked like, and kind of, did those conditions come back? What happened with them? You don't necessarily need to get the nitty-gritty specifics, but just what that has looked like in terms of that ongoing conversation when maybe there was something that I don't necessarily want to say missing, but we as a collective needed to learn more about, and if anyone wanted to kind of comment on that.
I mean, I can comment. Big KK is going to remind me about the details because I might get them wrong. But the two conditions that come to mind are severe combined immunodeficiency and Pompe disease. And it was interesting that the advisory committee was very clear at the end of the review for severe combined immunodeficiency that although the pieces looked like they were all pointing towards benefit of intervention, there had yet to be any case that had been detected through newborn screening. And that was part of what motivated the whole discussion around pilot screening. And I see that some people I'm pointing this way as if you know what I'm pointing at, but I'm pointing at the questions that popped up. But that's one of the issues around the requirement for a pilot study. And I'll defer questions about that to Dr. Powell. But that was a case where everyone, the science all pointed that there was really a benefit from early detection, but there was just this very important gap. And very quickly after that, I can't remember how many months it was, but there was a case identified, and the advisory committee went ahead and recommended to the secretary that it be added to newborn screening. And so that was one case. And then with Pompe disease, there were a lot of open questions around the benefits of early intervention, and also, if I remember correctly, some questions about screening, but it was really around treatment issues and those kinds of things. And that was one that came back in with additional science and moved through. But those are the two examples that I can think of where the advisory committee reconsidered a condition and it was subsequently added. KK, am I forgetting anything?
Those are the big ones, I think, that I was thinking as well. It seems like I believe that SMA, I mean, many of them actually came through initially and were not accepted then, and got some specific information or specific requests from the committee coming back. I wanted to note, just because I think I caught on one of the questions, right, for Pompe, some of the information that helped. Actually, we did pull a lot from the screening program that was going on in Taiwan for that one. And the pilot study requirement was not part of the nomination kind of criteria at that point. What we were able to pull from, and I believe that if I recall, we spoke with those researchers about that program and that screening process. So that helped a lot. And also, I think with the screening on how they were able to adjust for the pseudo deficiency findings and whatnot. So the international programs can be helpful.
Great, thank you for that. And another question for the entire group is, we, especially in what Alex discussed and KK discussed, there's a lot of data collection, it sounds like, that's done during the evidence review. It's not just a review, but, you're just speaking about, speaking to researchers, discussions about the work that the Association of Public Health Laboratories does in terms of their surveying. Have there been, just to see, you know, the readiness of the system to start screening for a condition, have there been any discussions about either going back and reviewing, you know, now that we've had some of these processes in place for close to 10 years, to see, you know, were we on track, were we not, any opportunities for lessons learned there? I could see even from the patient advocacy group to see how, you know, what someone maybe would have thought the process was going to look like when a condition went up for nomination compared to 5 years later. I just wondered if there had been any discussions about that or any perspectives from you all in terms of looking at that data that was collected through the evidence review process and then seeing, oh, well, what did we match up? Did we not? What that looked like.
You know, of course, you know, and I'm a general pediatrician, right? I want to improve health outcomes for people in KK, you know, their psychology background. We're all invested in improving population health. Actually, I look at my population health thing on the back. But if your question is, you know, a formal review and that kind of thing, I'll defer to Dr. Powell in her role as chair of the advisory committee.
Well, you know, as you know, the committee just makes a recommendation. I mean, we vote, and either, you know, if we vote that we feel that this should go forward, it goes to the Secretary of Health and Human Services for the sort of final decision. And one thing that I thought of that we hadn't talked about is that, you know, in terms of like the 9-month process and then sending it to the Secretary, you know, that may take a while. The Secretary could ask for additional data before making a final decision. So that happens sometimes. And for the most recent condition that was approved and placed on the RUSP SMA, the Secretary did ask for another review within, what was the period of time, Alex?
Within
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah,
So that's been something that Alex and KK have worked on. The committee is planning to vote on that, you know, sort of updated information that with data that they've gathered at our next meeting. And so that's one example of kind of, you know, going back to see how has it worked, you know, and has the newborn screening for SMA been, you know, on the whole beneficial and things like that. And then Alex and KK have recently reviewed some of the other conditions that were added in the last 10 years or so to the RUSP. So I think the committee realizes that that's very important, Natasha, to think about, you know, how have those programs worked? You know, there's not a process at this time to remove conditions from the RUSP. I think that's, you know, another reason why we're very careful and selective and thoughtful in, you know, making a decision about new conditions. Anyway, I think, you know, it's helpful though to go back and even looking at some of the very first conditions that were, you know, screened for in newborns. I think it's a very helpful process to you know, review after so many years to see how things are going.
Great, thank you. I'm going through some of the Q&A. One question that came up that that I think maybe mainly for Alex, but I think others can chime in, is you had mentioned kind of the model that that you work on with, I believe it was Dr. Prosser, in terms of modeling. Can you talk a bit more about that and how you see that as adding to the evidence review process?
Yeah, so I wish I had like the model to show, but basically it's a mathematical model that compares screening to what might happen with usual clinical care. What it does is it's another way to present the information that's in the evidence review. And for example, if you know what the sensitivity is and the specificity of a test, then you know how many cases you're going to find, how many you're going to miss, how many false positives that you're going to have. And then if we know for example, the likelihood of survival from early detection versus survival from late detection, then you could model off and say, well, you know, newborn screening would identify this many cases, would have this many false positives, and might miss this many cases. And of the cases that were detected, then we know that at least over some period of time, maybe a year or two, this many of the children are going to, of these hypothetical children, are going to survive well and not require mechanical ventilation, versus the other children who weren't screened, these other hypothetical children, this many of them might have these adverse outcomes. And so it presents a nice little table and is just another way to present the more nuanced information that's in the full evidence review. It's another way of looking at the same data. One of the things that's interesting in looking at this is that you can only model based on how much data you have. So for example, we spoke the other week about the importance of having longitudinal data. Well, you know, you can only talk about, like, you know, survival and those kinds of things for as long as you have longitudinal data. So oftentimes we're stuck with only being able to do this modeling out for maybe a year or two, not the, you know, many years or decades that might be nice. So it's just another way to synthesize very complicated information to help with the conversation and also point to gaps. So if the modeling only goes out for some short period of time, that's just the area that you have with certainty. You also see that when you look at the models, we have estimates, we have ranges because of the uncertainty in the data. And so we can also present that, and it can help people who read the reports, who look at these models, understand, you know, how much uncertainty there is in the ranges of that kind of thing. I think that in addition to synthesizing the data, it's also important to help identify limitations of the data and where more research is needed. And so that's really what it does. I think of it as an extension of the evidence review.
If I can,
yeah,
super quickly add to that, the way my more simplistic mind thinks of it also is kind of taking all these individual clinical trials or smaller trials, right? Looking at individual patient benefit and onto the population of the U.S. to, you know, with the different estimated ranges and confidence intervals and whatnot, right, to be able to say that kind of accounts for that, and to say overall in the population, this is what, you know, these few studies that are suggesting some net benefit on an individual, how that'll look like on the population as a whole, just as another angle.
Great, thank you. I'm looking through the questions. I think there's some that we may be able to get through a bit quicker. And I think we touched a little bit on this, but, you know, if there were multiple nominations that came in, how would those be prioritized? Would it just continue to be first come, first serve, or how that goes along? And I feel like that's happened in the past before, where multiple have come in pretty close in time.
Yeah, I mean, not since I've served on the committee, so I'll let Alex talk about that.
Yeah, I would say, you know, the advisory committee, you know, reviews nomination packages and hands them off to us. It's not like, you know, it's not like a runway where only one airplane can take off at a time. What I'll say anecdotally is, because there's so much work that goes into the nomination process, it's not like, you know, a bunch of them have been approved by the advisory committee to be sent to us at the same time. But, you know, if those kinds of things happen, then, you know, first of all, it'd be exciting, right? But the key message that I want to say is that there's nothing about our evidence review work group that says that only one condition can be looked at a time. We work on behalf of the advisory committee funded through HRSA, and if there was, you know, 2 or more conditions that were ready to be critically appraised for the advisory committee to add to the RUSP, then, you know, we would, you know, happily go forth and work on those.
I think it's an excellent question, though, and it is something I think the committee and HRSA has to think about, and we may have a chance to talk a little bit more about that in the next session.
Great, thank you. I wanted to come back, this came up a little bit, but give a bit more attention to, you know, the need to identify a patient through a pilot. And I know just from kind of what I've seen that has become more and more of a discussion within the committee and within groups who are doing their nominations. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to that and kind of the focus on those prospective pilots.
Yeah, so I think, again, you know, it's a good question, and for some conditions, this screening may be much, you know, more accurate, specific, and sensitive as well. And, you know, I know it's a source of frustration for a lot of groups, you know, who have had pilots, some going on for, you know, several years where they've not identified a case yet. And, you know, whereas it might be a very important condition to be able to screen for, you know, it can be frustrating with those pilots. With full disclosure, I have gotten funding to help run pilots, and currently am funded to be part of a newborn screening pilot project and research in newborn screening. So, you know, I think it can work both ways, that the data, you know, having it in a more real world setting, in a pilot setting, you do learn a lot about, you know, where you should have your cutoffs and how this would work in a newborn screening laboratory, and, you know, can see what, you know, how families react, you know, how hard is it to do confirmatory testing. You know, it's, again, it's not just that laboratory piece, it's all the follow-up parts that, you know, we have to make sure run smoothly. So, but I do agree, you know, I don't know is, you know, down the line that will continue to be a hard and fast rule about, you know, having to identify at least one case in a pilot study. Open for discussion, I think.
Great. Another question that came through was, you know, there hasn't been any nomination package that was encompassing multiple indications. Is that something that's allowed? Is that something even as like a thought experiment has been discussed, and any comments or thoughts on that?
Can you clarify too what you mean by multiple indications?
I will hope that the person who submitted that question will do that. But I will say, when I read that, the conversations that I have thought of is, you know, people really wanting to, you know, now that we're doing kind of multiplexing and, you know, being able to submit and say, we know we can find these 10 things using this technology, and just submitting it at, you know, just all of those together.
Right.
You know, that's been one thing. I know that for a while, there's been a lot of discussion around gene panels and submitting those as opposed to going from condition to condition, but really, you know, what can we learn from this panel of genes? So I think any and all of that would be great to hear from you, what your thoughts have been.
So there's two things. Let me set the stage, and I'm gonna hand it to Dr. Powell because she's smarter than I am anyway. But there's two issues, right? So one is a panel that might be able to identify a bunch of different disorders. So you can imagine being able to screen for 4 different lysosomal storage disorders at one time. Then should one look at all of the lysosomal storage disorders? And I think that's one thing that you brought up. But the other thing is screening for a mutation with a gene panel. And I'm going to give you my perspective as a pediatrician and sort of outside of the evidence review work group, which is we screen to identify health conditions that benefit from intervention. And what we've learned is that sometimes just because you have a particular mutation may or may not mean that you're going to develop any particular disorder. So I think that it's important when we talk about screening in general that we talk about the kind of health conditions that we want to find or the diseases that we want to prevent and those kinds of things. And so it's important that we keep that framework, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to make things better for children and their families. And it's the things that impact your quality of life that lead to death that are important. It's not some like level of an enzyme or those kinds of things which you don't actually feel. And so I think it's important when we talk about helping people that we think about the patient-centered or the family-centered things that we can find and we can treat. So I think if it's just looking at particular mutations, we need to be very careful about that. But if it's looking at a bunch of different conditions that are related and be identified on the same platform, that's sort of a different thing. And that I'd refer to Dr. Powell in terms of her role at the advisory committee.
Yeah, I mean, we do need to figure out how to address that, because I think, more and more that's going to come up as, conditions can be multiplexed, so we're going to have that information. We'll have the analyte data, and if we kind of mask it, is that really ethically correct, to do that if we're not going to report it out? And yet, if we have, even 4 or 5 conditions that presumably can be detected, how do we go through a careful evidence review for each one of those? And do we need to, start considering conditions as more of a sort of a group package? And, I don't have an answer, but I think we need to continue to be as careful as we have been, but yet, realize that there are many rare diseases that are now, screenable and treatable. And so I think, it's going to need to be something that the committee considers how to address in the future.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. This was a great discussion. There are a number of questions that came through that I think we will be able to touch upon in the next session. But again, I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time and for sharing your perspectives. And I will now send it back to Dylan.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I would love to second that. Thank you from Natasha to this wonderful panel. It was really eye-opening and really answered a lot of great questions. Before we go into a quick 5-minute break so everybody can stretch their legs, I wanted to discuss the kind of 5th week of our boot camp. So we're going to be holding discussion groups, which will allow for attendees to really start to communicate with each other and discuss all that has been learned during this boot camp, kind of best practices and how they want to move forward. And we're going to separate that into 3 different discussion groups. And each discussion group, we're going to ask you to kind of self-identify where you are in newborn screening. Are you just new to newborn screening? This is kind of your first exposure to it and really learning about newborn screening, want to continue to learn more. The second group is going to be essentially those working towards the RUSP. So you're kind of on that path, and where you're on that path can vary widely, but you're kind of on that path. And the third group would be kind of beyond the RUSP. So you advocate for a condition that is on the RUSP and you're focusing on the newborn screening system past that. And so as we go into our 5-minute break, I'm going to launch a poll. Please feel free to click on it and self-identify which discussion group you would like to be a part of. So that way, when we come back in 2 weeks for the discussion groups, we can have some really great conversations. So thank you again to our panel. I'm really looking forward to our next panel, which will continue this great conversation around the advisory committee, and hope everyone enjoys their 5-minute break. Thank you so much. Dr. Powell and Dr. Bocchini, if you're there, now would be a great time to unmute and turn your video on, or get started in about a minute.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Thanks for saving me in the end there. I don't know what happened to my invitation. Cindy, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good.
And I think we are at 2:40, so I think we're in the interest of time, we're gonna get started. So thank you for everybody who's joining us today again. And we're very excited about this next panel. It's really gonna be more of kind of a fireside chat, or really a conversation between two wonderful people, Dr. Joseph Bocchini, the former chairman of the advisory committee, and Dr. Cynthia Powell, the current chairperson of the advisory committee, with Natasha Malone continuing to moderate. So thank you again for everybody for staying around. The poll will be closing momentarily, and please enjoy the fireside chat. Natasha, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I am really looking forward to this fireside chat, and for those who haven't been a part of those, it really is meant to be, you know, introducing different topics, but really meant to be a conversation and kind of to allow us to kind of think and ponder about a range of different things. I think a lot of the themes that emerged in this past panel will come up here, but to kick things off, it would be great if we can have both of you introduce yourselves. We can start with Dr. Cindy Powell, and just kind of introduce yourself and kind of your relationship now and as it has been to the advisory committee.
Sure. Thank you, Natasha. So I'm currently the chair of the advisory committee, and I'm a clinical geneticist, pediatrician in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. I have worked for a number of years in studies of newborn screening, how to utilize next generation sequencing for newborns, as having one of the EnSight projects funded by NIH, and continue to work in various pilot studies of newborn screening, and in a project called Early Check, which is a voluntary newborn screening program that we have in North Carolina, collaborating with RTI International and other CTSAs in our state. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Bocchini?
So hi, I'm Joe Bocchini. I'm a pediatric infectious disease specialist, and I spent a number of years of my career at LSU Health Sciences Center in Shreveport, and now I am at Tulane University serving as vice chairman of the Department of Pediatrics, and I am director of pediatric services at the Willis-Knighton Health System in Shreveport, Louisiana. I became interested in newborn screening years ago when an opportunity was brought to me to join the Louisiana State Newborn Screening Advisory Committee. And so I've been involved with newborn screening through that committee for many years. I then had an opportunity to be nominated for the Secretary's Advisory Committee, and then following Rod Howell's the term as chair, I was asked to serve as chair, and so I preceded Cindy with a 9-year term as chairman of the committee, and then very happily turned it over to someone with more expertise in genetics than I have. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'd love to kick off this conversation with you know, both of you reflecting on how you have seen the role of the advisory committee evolve over time, both as your time on the committee as members and then as chair. And I leave it up to either of you to start with that question.
Do you want to go first, Dr. Bocchini?
Sure, I can lead into this. So I think the key role of the committee has stayed the same. I mean, the main purpose of the committee is to provide evidence-based reviews, to bring continuity across the country with recommendations that are scientifically based for conditions that need to be placed on the RUSP. And so I think that core mission of the committee has not changed, but everything around it, I think, has, because I think as the committee has matured and as newborn screening has changed, it became very clear that the committee could serve as a central role but really needed to be part of an entire system for newborn screening. So by that I mean, as we developed policies, obviously we needed to have input from the states so that the states could tell us what they were prepared to do and how they could do it and what kind of impact what we were considering would have on the states. We needed help from the NIH, we needed help from the newborn screening community, we needed help from the CDC with laboratory procedures, as well as providing education and training for different states. So I think that the committee has evolved to really have a much better understanding of the impact of what it does and how to determine how to address those impacts in such a way that we're all working together to effectively improve newborn screening across the country in the best way that we possibly can.
And I certainly agree with Dr. Bocchini. And I think, you know, when I think back to sort of how the committee initially got formed as a result of some of the discrepancies between states, you know, in terms of the number of conditions that they were screening for, and the desire to have more uniformity across the United States in terms of those conditions. There, you know, that was really brought about from the tandem mass spec and how many conditions could be screened for using that that technology. And we're kind of at a similar crossroads, I think, now with the advent of you know, more or improved mass spec techniques, as well as some of the, you know, next generation sequencing, the genetic testing that we have available. And so I think, you know, the work of the committee is as important as it ever was, you know, to make sure that we're selective, but yet allow this new technology to be utilized, you know, to improve the health of children. And that's really what the committee was formed for, really was to, you know, improve children's health. I think that's what we always have to keep in our minds, you know, as we pursue this work. One of the current challenges, of course, has been that the committee is authorized under the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act, which was not reauthorized. And so we're currently functioning only as a discretionary advisory committee, which, you know, on the surface doesn't really make any difference in terms of the work of the committee, although, you know, new members had to get approved, and it sort of has impacted, I think, the flow of the committee work. Certainly, you know, between that and the pandemic, you know, our work has definitely been delayed in some respects. So I think moving forward, you know, we need to make sure that we are a permanent part and not just a discretionary advisory committee.
And I think there certainly was significant congressional support for the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act to be reauthorized. And I'm not sure, with everything else that's been going on in Congress, how it may have been delayed, but I thought that there had been considerable support because of the successes of the newborn screening program, as well as the committee, to continue this as a full Secretary's Advisory Committee. So I hope that that gets back on track very soon to allow the full measure of the committee. So Cindy, did you, I know one of the things that we thought was really important for the committee was to kind of keep things up to date with our policies and procedures and adjust our management of condition nominations, as well as putting them through the nomination review process, as well as the evidence review process, and then our decision making, bringing that up to date. And I know we started initiatives together to try and bring those forward. Have you been able to maintain those to kind of bring evidence review and, you know, adjusting based on new evidence on how to do these properly and how to inform the decision-making of the committee?
Well, the committee is going through a process to kind of review the whole decision matrix, and does it really capture all the components that are essential to being able to make a truly informed decision. We continue to work with Alex and KK on that process, and I think a very important part of that is the whole project on the values. Are we really able to capture the important values and the values of various stakeholders in newborn screening? It's very challenging, especially in a 9-month period to capture that, but I know that it's something that HRSA is very interested in, and hopefully there'll be some funding to pursue perhaps some pilot projects in that area. But I think even on a maybe limited basis to begin with, we're going to try to, address the values part of the whole nomination process and decision process.
I think that's an important additional component to be considered that I think will help inform the activities of the committee as well as the decisions that the committee needs to make when it comes to the final decisions as the committee goes through the matrix.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Well, that covered the next question that I was going to ask so perfectly, going along with the theme of a fireside chat and discussion. One question that came through during the last panel that I thought would be really great to bring up here was someone was asking about, when thinking about the nomination and the information that's shared with the committee, did personal stories and the impact of a child not being screened and thus not being detected early for a condition play any role in the committee proceedings, or was it strictly to the scientific data that was presented? And the three of us know that there's opportunities for public comments and opportunities to share those stories and to share those perspectives. But I'd really like to hear you both kind of elaborate on what that brings to the discussion when there is a discussion of adding a condition to the RUSP, or even just discussing, where's newborn screening going, when there are those opportunities for public comments and sharing from patient advocacy groups and parents.
Right, yeah, thank you. I'm glad we have a chance to talk about that, because I saw that in the Q&A box. And, there are opportunities at each committee meeting for public comment. And the, dates and times of the meeting are posted, and individuals who want to, either come in person when that's possible, hopefully will be sometime before too long, or by virtual meeting, address the committee, or by written comment. Certainly the public is welcome to do that, and that can be at any meeting. It doesn't necessarily have to be in conjunction with a discussion about a nomination for a condition, but that time when the committee is, hearing the evidence review, that's also a time when there can be presentations by parents and or patients with, the condition being considered. And I think, that is important. Certainly we want to include the public, and, those stories from individuals are very impactful. And so I would definitely think that's an important part. I think, that sort of goes along with some of the values that, we're examining how to address those issues. And so certainly, would encourage people to do that.
I agree with Cindy 100%. I think having personal stories is a critical component to assessing values and to understanding the impact of the whatever condition that the committee is considering. So I always felt that having parents and families and affected individuals who came and presented their stories was a really important component of the entire work of the committee. So we certainly would encourage that from advocacy groups as well as the organizations that represent individuals who are affected with a certain condition to be really a part of the process by coming and telling their personal stories.
Thank you. What challenges did you or are you facing as chair? And I think you can take that in any direction that you would like to, but something that's particular to being chair of this committee compared to when you were just a member, but any challenges or obstacles or opportunities, as they say, have you come across?
Well, I think it's been challenging since I became chair, between the non-passage of the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act and having to go through, becoming a discretionary committee, having to cancel meetings, and now we're continuing to struggle through COVID and, limiting some of the work. Our timelines for many projects have been delayed. In some respects, it's, I guess, been good that we haven't had a condition that we've, that's going through the evidence review process. So that hasn't been delayed, and maybe that's a time to kind of catch up on some of these other things. But, so that's definitely been challenging. Fortunately, the folks at HRSA are wonderful, and they're doing their best to make sure that the committee moves forward, but it's a lot of things beyond their abilities, beyond their sort of just area. It's often not HRSA things, it's above that. So I won't say anything more about that, but anyway, that's certainly been a challenge. And then, not that this has really come about yet, but I just, when I gave a little talk, when I took over as chair, sort of as Dr. Bocchini was passing the baton to me, and talking about sort of the future things that I think we'll have to deal with, and some of that's come up during the discussions that we've had as part of this boot camp, but that, how to address sort of multiple conditions at one time, perhaps. Are there some guidelines that we can have that may apply to many, many conditions, whether they're, genetic conditions or due to infectious diseases? And are there some basic guidelines that we could sort of agree upon that if they're met, we can still have to look at the finer details, but maybe the process can be streamlined a bit, if there's some, basic things that we could agree upon in terms of, impact, health impact, and the benefits of treatment. So I think we are going to need to figure out a way to kind of streamline the process, knowing that there are so many, rare disorders. Fortunately, there are treatments that are, being developed and hopefully will be successful, whether that's through gene therapy or just, new drug development, gene editing with CRISPR, things like that. But I think we're going to need to get ourselves ready for that.
And I first of all, I want to agree with Cindy that HRSA leadership for this committee is just wonderful and incredibly helpful in solving problems and trying to move forward with all of the potential barriers that develop over time due to failure to pass the reauthorization bill and the whole series of other governmental changes that forced us to change committee meeting dates or cancel meetings. They've been really excellent in providing us the infrastructure to make the committee work. I think one of the big challenges that we had was the recommendation in the last reauthorization, not the recommendation, but the requirement that we had 9 months to work through a nominated condition. And so we had to do our best to modify our procedures to try and get more information in the nomination package so that we would have more information to work with when things went through the committee to the evidence review so that they had adequate time to do their work. And I think that was a big challenge that I think the committee really came up and was able to deal with. The evidence review committee made the changes that they needed, and so I think that was very that worked out quite well. I think a number of challenges kind of come up all the time. You know, we had a parent who, during the public comment, indicated to us that there was a delay in identification of a newborn condition. That was one of the severe early onset conditions. And after thinking about that, the committee decided that we would look into timeliness. And it turned out that in addition to us looking at it, there was evolving data that there were a number of issues with meeting the recommendations that the committee had made some years ago about timeliness through each process of the newborn screening process. And so the committee took on the challenge of identifying where the problems were. HRSA helped by providing funding to allow surveys to be done, and we were able to identify some real issues with maintaining timeliness as recommended. We modified the recommendations and brought them out again. And I think then through funding through HRSA, there was work through APHL for QI projects and other things to help improve the timeliness of aspects of newborn screening. And now that is a part of what the committee's responsibilities are, to try and maintain a watch on this and report on an ongoing basis of how effective these changes have been and where we are as a country in providing timely reporting of conditions to help families as best we can when children are identified with a condition that requires immediate attention. And I'm sure there are many others that arose as challenges to us because of issues that came to us from the public or from members of the committee or from organizational representatives. In your area, Natasha, there were a number of issues related to education, which were addressed. So I think there are a number of challenges that come up in terms of prioritizing and how to address those issues when they happen. But I think the committee's been quite successful with the expertise on the committee and the support of all of the board reps and public in making things happen.
Thank you for that. I know over the course of the past few weeks, we've talked about the role of the committee and what it can do and what it does not do in terms of it makes a recommendation. I always say the R in RUSP is recommend, not require, and that this is a committee that really focuses on making recommendations to the secretary, and then the secretary makes determinations. But with all of that, we know that oftentimes for states, it takes years to implement a RUSP recommendation. For SCID, you know, a condition that oftentimes has been seen as a hallmark of going through the process and getting data, you know, it really took a decade from when it was, you know, officially part of the RUSP to having full implementation at the state level. I think we see that going much faster for many conditions, but could you speak to either what can be done or what could help, or the discussions that are had at the advisory committee level when thinking about state adoption of the RUSP. And we did speak about the public health impact survey that was implemented, and we want to touch a bit on that again, but that's always the question that comes up when we talk about RUSP and newborn screening. It's that state implementation, and just wanting to get your perspectives on that.
Should I go first?
Sure, go ahead, Cindy.
Well, I think that's certainly a reason why, the committee considers that, the potential for this to, a condition to be added to any state in the country. And, not just the states that maybe have a whole lot of resources and expertise, but, all the states potentially. And I think we still need to consider that, but I do think that as you said, Natasha, it's up to every state. The legislation that has been passed in some states that requires conditions to be added if they are on the RUSP. Some states have complained about that, but I think those in the rare disease communities have been very happy that will push things along. Some states, include like within a certain period of time, 2 to 3 years, and have some other parts of the legislation present that it still has to go through, an independent review within the state. But it's really a grassroots effort, I think, in each state that's going to help get new conditions added. It's often not the newborn screening laboratories. It can be a matter of the cost and how, is that going to be paid for? Is the newborn screening fee going to be increased? Is that money going to be taken out of another pot of money, involved with public health? How, is that actually going to happen? But I think, the more families present their cases, I think, North Carolina, where I live, was, I think, one of the last states to start SCID newborn screening. Unfortunately, despite having one of the world's experts, Dr. Rebecca Buckley at Duke, here, and, despite all her efforts, but it was really the stories from families that, went in and met, at some of the committee meetings in our state legislature, and, got to know the legislators, and that's what did it. That's what eventually, got it started in North Carolina, and I'm sure that's the same in many states. So, the grassroots, the hearing from the public, contacting state legislators, working, with various groups, advisory groups and things in your state is very helpful.
Yeah, I guess we're, if the public health is a state responsibility, and so every public health department is different, and every approach, as Cindy said, to adding something to the newborn screening panel is going to be different from state to state. And I think one of the things that I would hope people are, and of course, as Cindy indicated, the funding for public health has to be divided based on the different programs that public health provides in individual states. And so if there's limited funding, to be able to add something in one area may mean that public health can't do something in another. So there's a great tension to be able to do everything that public health really wants to do based on at least finances, as well as the administrative things that need to take place to bring something on to the newborn screening panel in an individual state. What I hope is going on is that people are thinking about the fact that we do expect that additional conditions are going to be added. and that the frequency may increase pretty significantly over time because of the changes in newborn screening and availability of testing and treatments, so that they can learn how to expedite within their own state whatever process is needed to try and bring something on to their newborn screening panel. And as Cindy said, I think that might take advocacy from the public, as well as advocacy within the public health system for making newborn screening one of the priorities, and learning how within that state it would be the best way to fund it, so that we don't spend 3 to 5 years from the time a RUSP recommendation is approved by the secretary to when the majority of states or a number of states incorporate that into their screening program.
Great, thank you for that. One final question. The committee is called the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, not just the Committee on Newborn Screening. And we know newborn screening touches on lots of different topics. I was just wondering if you could share a bit on some of the either emerging topics or other topics that you either have or would hope to discuss as a committee when really looking at, identifying early a range of different conditions, especially as we know, and you've more than alluded to, but saying, there's more gene therapy coming, there are more treatments coming along, and just kind of what does that, for you, Dr. Bocchini, what that looked like, what topics you brought to the committee for discussion outside of the RUSP, and as well as for you, Dr. Powell, that you have or would like to see discussed as we think about this as a much broader system than just RUSP.
Well, one of the things that I thought was important for us to be considering, not only as a committee, but as part of a broader approach, would be to address this issue of pilot studies. That as we understand, conditions are coming close to being considered, and that pilot studies are really an important part of learning how effective a new test might be to identify patients, that we find some way through funding to identify organizations, states that could help provide pilot data as a condition is being evaluated, to enable the committee to have the necessary data from pilot studies to be able to help make the decision about the laboratory aspect of the case. And so I think that the efforts that are being made now to try and develop some form of a consortium of early adapter type states that might be able to provide data might be very helpful to move something along more quickly. And to me, that is a prime issue that we need to address. I also think that some of the data that we were looking at in terms of understanding risk assessment and helping standardize for states potential approaches for not only laboratory techniques or laboratory studies on risk assessment and modifying ranges and all of those things might be helpful to sort of make people have a better understanding of why some laboratories have different ranges than others, and why that exists, and how to educate the public as well as providers on how to interpret data from screening tests as well as definitive tests as well. I think those are at least two out of many things that we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, there's never a lack of things that I think the committee could address. One thing we've been working on is the interoperability, that, we currently don't have a good system of long-term follow-up for patients identified through newborn screening. And if we're really going to be able to gather the data, how do these children do after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we really need to have a better system to do that. And is there a way that, like hospital electronic health records, could communicate with the public health system and track that information. You know, and along those lines, just in general, you know, long-term follow-up registries, patient registries. Right now, a lot of that's been done at the level of, you know, patient advocacy organizations or pharmaceutical companies. But I don't think that's really going to be a solution in the long term. I think it's really going to have to be a public health effort while still maintaining patient and family confidentiality, which people are always concerned about. You know, we have work groups that are made up of usually one or two committee members, but also individuals with, you know, who come from various backgrounds and expertise. And it's a good way to get involved with some of the committee work. Unfortunately, because of some of the current situations, you know, our work groups have not been able to meet. But I think, you know, there's a lot of important work that's addressed by those groups. And, you know, in terms of like funding for medical foods, you know, for special metabolic, you know, formulas as well as foods, as, you know, people get older, is a very important thing. And, you know, there's been a work group that's addressed that. You know, as Dr. Bocchini mentioned, the timeliness project was very important. Ways, you know, we work with the CDC in terms of improving ways to, you know, pick up additional conditions, you know, utilizing current technologies. And so, you know, there's work being done there. I've always been interested in ethical issues involving newborn screening. We have some bioethicists, you know, on the committee, as well as parts of our working groups. So you know, I think we'll, you know, be working on various projects there as well.
And let me just mention, you know, we did sort of touch on this a little bit, but I think the interaction between the committee and its work and HRSA is very strong. And so many of the projects that HRSA funds are based on work that is done in the committee or projects that come out of the committee deliberations. And I think we talked a little bit about the importance of getting something from the RUSP onto the panel in every state. The other thing that we thought was really important was learning the impact of the most recent approved conditions and outcome. And so HRSA took that up, and now there are projects that I think Alex and his group is responsible for to identify what happened in two patients based on each of the conditions that we have identified and the states have now begun screening for. And those outcomes would help us decide going forward what issues we may not have addressed and what issues we need to know about for the next conditions that we identify.
Great, thank you. I know we could spend many more hours talking about this. I think there have been times when the three of us have actually done that. Maybe not right by a fire, but I want to say thank you so much to both of you for not just your time, but your candor and your openness and really giving us your perspective, both as chairs, but really as people who have really been so committed to newborn screening and to the health of children, and taking all your experiences and being able to share that with us and to comment on where things are at today and hopefully where we can go in the future. So we really just appreciate your time and candor through this. So, and with that, I will hand it off back to Dylan.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation to hear. Thank you again so much for being here today. And to all our attendees, thank you for the full day of conversations around the advisory committee. I want to share my screen really quick. Just one more final thank you to our sponsors. They make all of this possible, so thank you again. And see you all next week. Hope to see you again. We'll be discussing challenges beyond the RUSP and how patient advocacy organizations and state public health labs can really work together to move newborn screening forward. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a wonderful day.